Chapter 4. Chaotic air currents rising above a patchwork of cultivated fields seized Zancha's sphere. For several panicked heartbeats, as she battled the provisions bouncing around inside the sphere, Zancha didn't know where she was or why. After more than 3,000 years, she needed that long to climb out of her memories. The disorientation had passed before disaster could begin. Zancha was in control before the sphere brushed the bank of a tree-shadowed stream. It collapsed around her, a warm, moist film that evaporated quickly, as it had countless times before, but thoughts of what might have happened left her gasping for air. Zancha hadn't intended to lose herself in her memories. The past, when there was so much of it crammed into a single mind, was a kind of a madness. She dropped to her knees and wiped the film from her face before it had a chance to dry. Between coughs, Zancha took her bearing from the horizons, sun sinking to the west, mountains to the south, and gentle hills elsewhere. She'd come to her senses over the inner F1 pincher, precisely the place she wanted to be. Luck, Zancha told herself, and succumbed to another round of coughing. Zancha never liked to rely on luck, but just then thoughts of luck were preferable to the alternatives. She'd been thinking of her beginnings, as she rarely did. Worse, she'd been thinking of Gix. She'd never forgotten that blue-green spark. Despite everything, she worried that the demon's mark might still be lurking somewhere within her skull. She made herself think about Urza and all that they'd survived together. He could look inside her and destroy her if she became untrustworthy. So long as he didn't, Zancha believed she could trust herself. But thoughts of Gix were no reason to fear Gix. Nothing escaped the exorations of Phyrexia's seventh sphere. Even if the blue-green spark remained, the demon who drilled it into her was gone. Urza insisted that she steer clear of Phyrexians once she scented them. He didn't want his enemies to know where he was or that he'd returned to the land of his birth. They both knew that if she ever fell back into the Phyrexian hands, they'd strip her memories before they consigned her to the seventh sphere, and she knew too many of Urza's secrets to justify the risk. The Phyrexian presence on Dominaria had been growing over the past 50 years. Morvern and Bazarat were only two among a score of places where Zancha had once scrounged regularly, but were or soon would be off-limits. Effenpincher was not, however, among them. The little realm on the wrong side of the great island of Gulmeni was so isolated and unimportant that the rest of what had once been Terrasair scarcely acknowledged its existence. It was the last place Zancha expected to scent a Phyrexian. If she succumbed to the thoughts of Gix while soaring over the Effenpincher, it wasn't because of Phyrexian had tickled her mind, but because she'd begun to doubt Urza. True, he'd go to the places where she'd scented sleepers, and he'd find them, but he wouldn't do anything about them. Newts disguised as born folk weren't enough to goad Urza into action. Zancha thought it would take death for that. She'd been perversely pleased when she'd found a war in Bazarat and Morvern. She thought for sure that would overcome Urza's obsession with the past, and perhaps it had. He'd never come so close to striking her. Kayla bin Krug hadn't mentioned Effenpincher in her epic. Effen chroniclers explained that omission by proclaiming that their land had been empty until 300 years ago, when a handful of boats had brought a band of refugees to Gulmeni's backside. Zancha doubted that there had ever been enough boats in Terrasair to account for all the living Efflons, but scribes lied. She knew that from her Antiquity Wars collection. What mattered to Zancha was that among any 10 men of Effenpincher, at least one matched Kayla's word picture of Mishra, and another had his impulsive temperament. To find better odds, she'd have to soar across the Sea of Laments, something she'd done just once, by mistake, and had sworn she'd never try again. Zancha knew her plan to bring Urza face to face with a dark, edgy youth who might remind him of his long-dead brother. Wasn't the most imaginative strategy, but she was Phyrexian, and as Urza never ceased telling her, Phyrexians lacked imagination. Urza himself was a genius, a man of great power and limitless imagination, when he chose to exercise it. Once she had him face to face with her false Mishra, Zancha expected Urza's imagination would repair any defects in her clumsy Phyrexian strategy. Then Zancha caught herself thinking about the other notoriously failed strategies, Gix and thousands of identical sexless newts. What if I'm wrong? She asked the setting sun, the same question that Urza asked whenever she tried to prod him into action. The sun didn't answer, so Zancha gave herself the same answer she gave Urza. Dominaria is doomed if Urza does nothing. If he thinks his brothers come back to him, he might do something. And something, anything, is better than nothing. Zancha watched the last fiery sliver of sunlight vanish in the west. Her sphere had dried into a fine white powder that disappeared in the breeze. By her best guess, she'd been aloft without food, water, or restful sleep for 2.5 days. There was water in the stream and more than enough food in her shoulder sack, but sleep proved elusive. Wrapped in her cloak, Zancha saw Gik's toothsome face each time she closed her eyes. After watching the stars slide across the sky, she yawned out another sphere as the eastern horizon began to brighten. Zancha hadn't thought she'd find her Mishra in the first village she visited. Though experience on other worlds had convinced her that every village harbored at least one youth with more ambition than sense, it had stood to reason that she might need to visit several villages before she found the right combination of temperament and appearance. But temperament and appearance weren't her problems. In the 20 years since her last visit, war and famine had come to Evan Pincher. The cultivated field in which she'd spent her first sleepless nights had proved the exception to the new rules. The first village that Zancha approached was still smoldering. The second had trees growing from abandoned hearths. Those villages that remained intact did so behind palisades of stone, brick, and sharpened stakes. She approached the closed gates warily, regretting that she'd disguised herself as a cocky and aristocratic youth. It was an easy charade, one that matched her temperament and appearance, but throughout their wanderings, she and Urza had come across very few wars that couldn't be blamed on aristocratic greed or pride. The war in Evan Pincher, however, proved to be one of the rare exceptions. The gates swung open before she announced herself. The whole village greeted her with pleading eyes. They'd made assumptions. She was a young man who'd lost his horse and companions to the enemy. She needed their help. But most of all, they'd assumed she'd come to help them. Outnumbered and curious, Zancha made up her own assumption. She'd learn more if she'd let them believe what they wanted to believe. "You will go to Pinchah City and tell Tabarana that this is happening," the village spokesman said. Once he had offered her food and drink. "We're all too old to make the journey." "Tabarana does not know," another elder said, and all the villagers bobbed their heads in agreement. "He cannot know. If Tabarana knew, he would come to us. If he knew, he would help us. He would not let us suffer." A multitude of voices all saying the same thing. A man named Tabarna had governed Evan Pincher 20 years ago. Part priest, part prince, he'd been an able ruler. If the villagers' Tabarna was still the man Zancha remembered, though, he'd be well past his prime, and beloved or not, someone would be taking advantage of him. Usually that someone would be a man dressed as she was dressed, in fine clothes and with a good steel sword slung below his hip. Zancha couldn't ask too many questions, not without compromising her disguise, but she promised to deliver the villager's message. Red stripes and Shraddha were terrorizing the countryside. The village offered to give her a swayback horse for her journey. Zancha bought it instead with a worn silver coin and left the next day, before her debts grew any higher. The elders apologized that they couldn't offer her the escort of young noblemen deserved, but all their young men were gone, swept up by one side or the other. As she rode away, she couldn't guess how the Shraddha had gotten involved in a war. 20 years ago, the Shraddha had been a harmless sect of ascetics and fools. They preached that anyone who did not live by the 256 rules in Avohir's holy book was damned, but no one had taken them seriously. She had no idea who or what the Red Stripes were until she visited a few more villages. The Red Stripes had begun as royal mercenaries, charged with the protection of the palaces and temples that the suddenly militant Shraddha had begun threatening some 15 years ago. Oddly enough, in none of the tales Zancha listened to did she hear of the two groups confronting each other. Instead, they roamed the countryside, searching out each other's partisans, making acquisitions when nothing could be proved, then killing the accused and burning their homes. "The Shraddha," a weary villager explained, "tell us they are the wrath of Avohir, and they punish us if we do not live closely by Avohir's holy book. Then, after the Shraddha have finished us, the Red Stripes come. They see that the Shraddha didn't take everything, so they take what's left." "Every spring it begins again," one of the old women added. "Soon there will be nothing left." "Twice we have sent men to Tabarna. Twice they did not come back. We have no men left." Then, as in the other villagers, the survivors asked Zancha to carry their despair to Tabarna's ear. She nodded, accepted their food, and left on her sway-backed horse, knowing that there was nothing she could do. Her path would not take her to Pincher City, Tabarna's north coast capital. She'd begun to doubt that it would take her to a suitable Mishra either. With or without pitched battles, Evan Pincher had been at war for nearly a decade, and young men were in short supply. Zancha's path, a rutted dirt trail because her sphere wouldn't accommodate a horse, took her toward Medrin, a market town. A brace of gate guards greeted her with hands on their sword hilts and contempt in their eyes. Where had she been? How did a noble lad with fine boots and sword come to be riding a swayback nag? Zancha noticed that their tunics were hemmed with a stripe of bright red wool. She told them how she'd ridden into the countryside with older, more experienced relatives. They had been beset by the Shraddha, and she was the sole survivor, headed back to Pincher City. On a better horse, if there's one to be found. Zancha sniffed loudly. When it came to contempt, she'd learned all the tricks before the first boatload of refugees struck the Pincher shore. She also yawned out her armor before she'd ridden up to the gate. The Red Stripes were in for a surprise if they drew their swords against her. Good sense prevailed. They let her pass, though Zancha figured to keep an eye for her back. Even with a sword, a slight, beardless youth in too fine clothes was a tempting target, especially when the nearest protectors were also the likeliest predators. Zancha followed the widening streets until they brought her to a plaza where artisans and farmers hawked produce from wagons. She gave the horse to the farmer with the largest wagon in exchange for black bread and dried fruit. He asked how an unbearded swordsman came to be peddling a nag in Medrin town. Zancha recited her made-up tale. The farmer wasn't surprised that Shraddha would have slain her purported companions. The more wealth a man has, the less the Shraddha believe him when he says he abides by the book. Strange, though, that they'd risk a party as large as the one your uncle had assembled. Were me, I'd suspect the men he'd hired weren't what they said they were. Zancha shrugged cautiously. I'm sure my uncle thought the same, before they killed him. Then, because the farmer seemed more world-wise than the villagers, she tempted him with the thought that had nagged her from the beginning. He'd hired Red Stripes. Thought it would keep us safe. Shraddha never attacked men with red stripes on their tunics. The farmer took the bait, but not quite the way she expected. The Red Stripes don't bother with the Shraddha or where they live, and the Shraddha usually return the favor. But where there's wealth to be taken, every man's a target, especially to the... He fingered the hem of his own tunic. I won't speak ill of your dead, but it's a fool who trusts in stripes or colors. Zancha walked away from the wagon, thinking that it might be better to get out of Medrin immediately. She was headed toward a different gate than the one she'd entered when she spotted a knot of men and women huddled in the shade of a tavern. With a second glance, Zancha saw the bonds at their necks, wrists, and ankles. Prisoners, she thought, then corrected herself. Slaves. She hadn't seen slaves the last time she visited Pincher, nor had she seen any of the beleaguered villagers, but it was a rare realm, a rare world that didn't cultivate slavery in one of its many forms. Zancha took a breath and kept walking. She could see that a sway-backed horse found a good home, but there was nothing she could do for the slaves. Zancha continued walking, one step, another. Misery stopped her before she took a third. Looking back over her shoulder, she caught the eye of a slave who stared at her as if his condition were indeed her responsibility. Though they were at least 100 paces apart, Zancha saw that the slave was a dark-haired young man. I asked my husband's brother how he'd come to lead the Falaji horde, Kayla had written in the Antiquity Wars. Mishra replied that he was their slave, not their leader. He laughed, and I added that I, too, was a slave to my people, but his eyes were haunted as he laughed, and there were scars around his wrists. In all the time Zancha had read that passage, she followed Urza's lead and blamed Phyrexia for Mishra's scars and bitterness, but the Falaji had been slave-keeping folk, and looking across the Medrin Plaza, Zancha suddenly believed that Mishra had told Kayla a simple, unvarnished truth. Zancha believed as well that she'd found her Mishra. With Urza's armor still around her, she strode over to the tavern. Are they spoken for? She asked the only unchained man she saw, a balding man with a eunuch's unfinished face. He wasn't in charge, but after a bow, he scurried into the tavern to fetch his master, who proved to be a giant of a woman, garbed, like Zancha, in men's clothing, though in the slave's master case, the effect was intimidation rather than disguise. They're bound for Almaz, the slave master said. Her breath was thick with beer, but she wasn't nearly drunk. You know it's against the law to sell flesh here. By her posture, the slaver was right about the law and ripe for negotiation. I have more than gold, Zancha said, which was true enough. Money was never a problem for a planeswalker as her companion. The slave master hawked and spat. Bug's getting warm. Zancha thought fast. For ransom, then. I recognize a distant cousin in your coffle. You've kept him safe, no doubt. I'll pay you for your trouble and take him off your hands. Him? The slaver laughed until she belched. There were women in the slave string, and Zancha was disguised as a young and presumably curious man. A cousin, Zancha repeated, showing more anxiety than she felt. Let the slaver laugh and think what she wanted. Zancha had the other woman's attention, and she'd have the slave, too. For ransom! She unslung her purse, fished out a gold coin as big as her nose. 5 of those, Slaver said, smashing her open hand between Zancha's shoulder blade. For ransom! If she were truly in the market for a slave, Zancha would have protested that no one was worth 5 golden nari, but she'd been prepared to split 12 of the heavy Morven coins between a likely youth and his family. She dug out another 4 and handed them over to the slaver, who bit each one. Zancha knew the coins were true, but was relieved when they passed the slaver's test. Which one's your cousin? Zancha pointed to the dark-haired youth, who didn't blink under scrutiny. The slaver, whose eyebrows remained resolutely skeptical, shook her head. Pick another relative, boy. That one'll eat you alive. Blood's blood, Zancha insisted, and ours is the same. I won't leave with another. Garv! The slaver shouted to the eunuch to her side. She held out her hand, and Garv surrendered the slender black rod. The slaver took it and turned back to Zancha. Another nari. You're going to need this. Would ancient Ashnod be pleased by all the improvements Dominarian slavers and torturers had brought to her pain-inflicting artifacts in the centuries since her death? Zancha bought the thing, if only to keep the slaver or Garv from ever using it again. Cut him out, the slaver told Garv, and added while Garv walked among the slaves, Have fun, boy. I intend to, Zancha assured her, then watched as Garv seized the leather band around the youth's neck and jerked him roughly to his feet. Garv gave the band a vicious twist, so it choked the youth and kept him quiet while the eunuch snapped the rivets that bound Zancha's new slave to the others. The youth's face became red. His eyes rolled. I want him alive, Zancha warned in a low voice that promised her threats were as good as her gold. Her new slave dropped to one knee when Garv suddenly released him. Hacking spittle, he got himself upright before the eunuch touched him again. Riveted leather manacles bound his wrists close behind his back. He couldn't clean his lightly bearded chin. A short iron chain ran between his ankles. He could walk, barely, but not run. As he came closer, watching his feet, Zancha counted the sores and bruises she hadn't noticed while he was staring. Zancha hadn't been comfortable owning a horse. She didn't know what she would do with a slave. The thought of grabbing the arm's length of leather hanging from the band around his neck repelled her, though that was what everyone, including the youth, expected her to do. You're too tall, she said at last, though he wasn't as tall as Urza. She hoped that wasn't going to be a problem further along in the plan. You'll walk beside me until I can arrange something more. Zancha paused. Phyrexians might not have an imagination, but born folks certainly did, and there was something like silence to inspire the use of it. Something more appropriate. She smiled broadly, and her slave walked politely beside her, his chains clanking on the plaza's cobblestones. Zancha's thoughts were focused on how she'd get them both out of Medrun without attracting trouble from the Red Stripes. She wasn't expecting any other sort of trouble until the youth staggered against her. Muttering curse no effin had ever heard before, Zancha got an arm around his waist and shoved him upright. It wasn't a hard shove, but he groaned and made no attempt to start walking again. Sick sweat bloomed on his face. He'd burned through his bravery. Do you see that curb beside the fountain? A slight nod and a catch in his muscles. He was dizzy and on the verge of fainting. Get that far and you can sit, rest, drink some water. Water, he repeated, a hoarse, painful-sounding whisper. Zancha hoped his problems weren't serious. If Garv had damaged him, Garv wouldn't live to see the sunset. Her slave shoved 1 foot forward. She helped him with his balance. In 5 steps, Zancha learned to hate that treacherous chain between his ankles. He fell 1 stride short of the fountain curb. Zancha looked the other way while he dragged himself to it. Then she drew a knife from the seam of her boot. The blade was tempered steel from another world, and it made fast work of the wrist manacles. Zancha gasped when she saw rings of weeping sores. Without a second thought, she hurled the slashed leather across the cobblestones. Her slave was already washing his face and slurping water from the fountain. Zancha thought it was a good sign, but wasn't surprised when her next question, "Are you hungry?" won her nothing more than another cold, piercing stare. She retrieved a loaf of black bread, tore off a chunk, and offered it to him. He reached past her offering toward the loaf in her other hand. "You're bold for a slave." "You're small for a master," he countered and closed his hands over the bread he wanted. Zancha dropped the smaller piece and seized his arm. She didn't like the feel of open sores beneath her fingers, and she had every intention of giving him the whole loaf eventually, but points had to be made. She tightened her grip. Appearances, her still nameless slave needed to learn, could be deceiving. In Phyrexia, newts were soft, useless creatures, but on most other worlds, Zancha was as strong as a well-muscled man, double her size. With a groan, the slave let go of the larger portion. When she'd released him, picked up the smaller portion from the ground. "Slowly," Zancha chided him, though she knew it would be impossible for him to obey. "Swallow, breathe, take a sip of water." His hand shot out, while Zancha wondered what she should do next. He captured the unguarded bread and held it tight. Only his eyes moved from Zancha's face to the black prod she tucked in her belt. "Ask first," she suggested, but made no move for her belt. Even if, by some miracle of carelessness, he stole the prod and struck her with it, Urza's armor would protect her. "Master, may I eat?" For a man still short of his final growth, Zancha's slave had a mature grasp of sarcasm. He definitely had Mishra's attitude in addition to Mishra's appearance. "I didn't buy you to starve you." "Why did you then?" he asked through a mouthful of bread. "I have a need for a man like you." He gave Zancha the same look the slaver in Garv had given her, and she began to think she'd gotten herself into the position of a fisherman who hooked a fish larger than his boat. Only time will tell if she'd bring him aboard or he'd drown her. "Your name will be Mishra. You will answer to it when you hear it." Mishra laughed, a short, snorting sound. "Oh, yes, Master Urza." Despite what she'd told Urza, the details of Caleb Bing Krug's antiquity wars weren't that widely spread across what remained of Terrasair. Zancha had expected her slave to recognize his new name, nor was she prepared for his aggressive insolence. "I've made a mistake," she told herself. "I've done a terrible thing." Then Mishra started choking. He tugged on the tight leather band around his throat and managed to gulp down his mouthful of bread. His fingers came away stained with blood and pus. Zancha looked at her own feet. She might have made a mistake, but she hadn't done anything terrible. "You may call me Zancha, and when you meet him, Urza is just Urza. He would not like to be called master, especially not by his brother." "Zancha? What kind of name is that? If I'm Mishra and you work for Urza, shouldn't your name be Tawnos? You're a little bit small for the part. Grow your hair out and you could play a Kayla, an ugly Kayla. By the love of Ava here, I was better off with Tuk-Tuk and Garv. You know the Antiquity Wars? Surprised? I can read and write, too, and count without using my fingers." He held up his hand, but saw something, the stains perhaps, that she'd already noticed that cracked his insolence. "I wasn't born a slave," he concluded softly, staring across the plaza at his memories. "I had a life. A name." "What name?" "Rat." "What?" She thought she'd misunderstood. "Rat. Short for Ratty. I grew into it." Another snorted laugh, or maybe a strangled slob. Either way, it ended when the neck leather brought on another choking spell. "Hold still," Zancha told him, and drew out her knife again. "I don't want to cut you." There wasn't even a flicker of trust in Rat's eyes as she laid the blade against his neck. He winced as she slid it beneath the leather. She had to saw through the sweat-hardened leather and pricked his skin a handful of times before she was done. The tip was bloody when it emerged on the other side. But he didn't make a grab for her or the weapon. "I'm sorry," she said when she was finished. Zancha raised her arm to hurl the collar away as she hurled the manacles. Rat caught the trailing leash. The leather fell into his lap. "I'll keep it." Zancha knew that in the usual order of such things, slaves didn't have personal property, but she wasn't about to take the filthy collar away from him. "I have a task for you," she said as he worried the collar between his hands. "I would have offered you the gold if you'd been free. You will be free, I swear it, when you've done what I need you to do." "And if I don't?" While Zancha wrestled for an answer for that question, a noisy click of red stripes entered the plaza from the east, the direction through which Zancha had hoped to leave. She and Rat were far from alone on the cobblestones, and she reasonably hoped that despite their mismatched appearance, him in rags and weeping sores, her with her boots and sword, they wouldn't draw too much attention. Rat saw the red stripes as well. He snapped the leather against his thigh like a whip. Red stripes, Zancha guessed, had something to do with his transformation from free to slave. Considering his apparent education and remembering the farmer's gesture, she wondered if he'd once wore the sort of garments she was wearing. "Hold it in," she'd advised him. "You've got a chain." She left the thought incomplete as a gentle breeze brought her the last scent she ever wanted to smell: glistening oil. One of the red stripes was a sleeper, a newt like her, but different, too. Newts of this new invasion had born folk ways and didn't clump together in cadres. In truth, they didn't seem to know they were Phyrexian. Zancha didn't care to test her theory. She hunched on her knees as she sat, catching her breath in her hands, hiding the exhaltations that might reveal her glistening scent. She couldn't relax or be too careful. Besides Zancha, Rat beat a counterpoint of curses and leather. There was a chance that the red-striped sleeper could hear every word. "Quiet!" Zancha hissed a command as she clamped her hand over Rat's. "Quiet!" She squeezed until she felt the sores and sinews pop. "Afraid of the red stripes?" She took a deep breath and admitted, "They're not my friends. Quiet!" Rat bent over to match her posture, blocking her view as well. He wouldn't stop talking. "And who are your friends? The Strata? You keep strange company. Urza, Mishra, the Strata. You're asking for trouble." Zancha ignored him. She hunched lower until she could see beneath Rat's arms. The red stripes were heading into the same tavern where the slaver drank. "We've got to leave. Can you walk?" "Why? I'm not afraid of the red stripes. I'd join them right now if they'd have me." The elders in the first village had warned Zancha that the young men had chosen sides one way or another. It figured that her Mishra would have Phyrexian inclinations. She didn't have the time to persuade him, so she'd have to outbluff him. "Want to hobble over and try? You better hurry, or do you think the eunuch saved you a seat?" "Not that stupid. I lost my chance the moment I got sapped and sold." "Then stand up and start walking." "Yes, master."